He built an empire worth $10 billion, skyscrapers, deals, power. But there was one thing his money could never buy back. His wife walked away and left their daughters behind for a price. Overnight, the billionaire became something he'd never truly been before, a full-time father. In the middle of the biggest deal of his career, his phone lit up, and nothing else mattered anymore. Years later, his daughter stood on a stage and called their home his greatest masterpiece of all. Aaron Whitmore built things for a living. But what he really built was an empire made of glass and steel and other people's envy. At 46, he was one of the most powerful real estate developers in New York City. A man whose name was etched into the lobbies of luxury towers from Tribeca to the Upper East Side. He designed homes for billionaires, senators, movie stars, sprawling penthouses with imported marble and private elevators, homes meant to announce to the world that the people living in them had arrived. Aaron understood exactly what made a house feel like a monument. What he understood far less was what made a house feel like a home. He hadn't always been this way. 20 years earlier, Aaron had been a hungry young architect with more ambition than money, sketching blueprints on napkins in a cramped Queens apartment, dreaming of the day his name would mean something in this city. He met Evelyn Hale at a gallery opening when he was 26, and she was, even then, the kind of woman who made every room feel like it existed to showcase her. They married 2 years later, young and hopeful, before the empire existed, before the money changed the shape of everything between them. The empire came slowly, then all at once. By his late 30s, Aaron was closing deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His name appearing in real estate trade publications, then in glossier magazines, then eventually in profiles that used words like visionary and titan. 2 daughters arrived during those years. Lily first, quiet and watchful even as an infant, and then Rose, 4 years later, a small storm of curiosity and mischief from the moment she could walk. Aaron loved his daughters fiercely. In the abstract, the way a man loves something he decided is important, without ever quite rearranging his life around that importance. He told himself the towers he was building were for them, that every closed deal was another brick in the foundation of their future. He didn't notice for a long time that foundations built on absence tend to crack. Evelyn noticed first, because she was the one standing in the empty rooms of their increasingly enormous homes, the one attending school recitals and pediatrician appointments alone, the one who had slowly transformed from Aaron's partner into something closer to a beautifully dressed single parent who happened to still be married. She wasn't a villain in this story, whatever else you might decide about her choices later. She was a woman who had married a man full of promise, and watched that promise consume him, who had spent a decade feeling like a guest in her own marriage, present at every important event of Aaron's career and absent from nearly every private moment of his heart. In the years before the divorce, Evelyn had tried, in her own way, to name what was happening between them. She'd suggested therapy twice, both times abandoned after a handful of sessions when Aaron's schedule made consistent attendance impossible. She'd asked him, on their 12th anniversary, whether he even remembered what it felt like to the teenage age want to come home rather than simply needing somewhere to sleep between deals, and Aaron, distracted by a term sheet on his phone, had not given her an answer she could hold on to. She began, slowly, to build a life adjacent to her marriage rather than inside it. Charity boards, long lunches with women in similarly gilded, similarly lonely arrangements, a sense of self entirely separate from the family photographs on the mantel. By the time she finally decided to leave, the decision had less of the drama of a sudden betrayal and more the quiet finality of a slow, years-long withdrawal reaching its inevitable end. That she chose to relinquish custody rather than fight for it said something true, and unflattering about where her own reserves had run dry. It did not erase the years she'd spent, earlier on, genuinely trying. By the time Lily turned 9 and Rose turned 6, Evelyn had made a decision she'd been circling for years. She wanted out, completely and permanently, on terms that would let her walk away from the marriage. And, devastatingly, from the daily weight of motherhood, without looking back. The divorce, when it came, was swift and clinical, negotiated more like a corporate acquisition than the ending of a family. Evelyn's lawyers were sharp, and Aaron, still reeling and unwilling to fight publicly over money when his daughter's stability was what actually mattered, agreed to terms that shocked even his own legal team. A substantial financial settlement, in exchange for Evelyn relinquishing primary custody entirely. She would remain a presence in Lily and Rose's lives in name, with occasional visits when it suited her schedule, but the daily architecture of parenting, the homework, the fevers, the nightmares, the 1,000 invisible tasks of raising 2 young girls, would belong to Aaron alone. On the day the papers were finalized, Evelyn stood in the doorway of the Fifth Avenue penthouse they'd shared, a single suitcase at her feet, and told Aaron, with something that sounded almost like relief, that she hoped he'd figure out how to be the parent she never quite became. Then she was gone, and the apartment felt enormous, and silent in a way it never had before. Aaron stood in that silence for a long time that first night, listening to the muffled sound of Rose crying in her bedroom down the hall, understanding with sudden, sickening clarity that he had absolutely no idea what he was doing. He had built a $10 billion empire. He had negotiated with mayors and closed deals that made front-page news, and he did not know, in that moment, how to comfort a 6-year-old who wanted her mother. He walked down the hallway anyway, because there was no one else to do it, and sat on the edge of Rose's bed in the dark, and said the only true thing he could think to say, "I don't know how to do this yet, but I'm going to learn, and I'm not going anywhere." Rose, still hiccuping through tears, asked if that meant he'd be at her class's family breakfast next week, the one Evelyn always used to attend. Aaron had a 9-figure acquisition closing that same morning. He said yes anyway, and spent the rest of the night quietly restructuring his entire calendar, for the first time in his adult life. The early months were a kind of controlled chaos. Aaron hired a capable, kind nanny named Marisol to help manage the daily logistics. But he made a decision early on that surprised everyone who knew him. He would not simply delegate his daughters to staff and reappear for holidays, the way so many men in his position did. He insisted on being the one to drive them to school most mornings. Clumsy at first with hair ties and lunchbox negotiations, learning through trial and error which cereal Rose would actually eat and which stuffed rabbit could never, under any circumstances, be left behind. Lily, older and more guarded, watched her father's efforts with a kind of cautious skepticism, as though she were waiting to see how long this new version of him would last before the old one returned. For a while it seemed like both versions of Aaron might have to coexist. His company, Whitmore Development, was in the middle of its most ambitious project yet, a mixed-use luxury tower on the Hudson waterfront that would, if completed successfully, cement his legacy as one of the most significant developers in the city's history. The deal required constant travel, marathon negotiation sessions, late nights with investors who did not particularly care that he had 2 young daughters waiting at home. Aaron tried, in those early months, to run both lives at once, sneaking out of board meetings to call Lily's teacher, reviewing spreadsheets during Rose's dance recitals, present in body at both his empire and his home, but rarely present in spirit at either. There were failures in those early months worth naming honestly, because the story of Aaron's transformation would mean little without them. 6 weeks after Evelyn left, Aaron missed Rose's kindergarten holiday recital entirely, not out of malice, but out of the old, deeply grooved instinct to let a client dinner run long, arriving at the school just as the last parents were filing out, and Rose was sitting alone on the edge of the stage, in her paper snowflake costume, having already scanned the audience for his face a dozen times during the performance. He found her there, quiet, in a way that frightened him more than tears would have, and the drive home was one of the longest of his life, filled with an apology he didn't yet know how to make land. Marisol, gently but firmly, told him afterward that competence with spreadsheets meant nothing to a 6-year-old scanning an audience for a face that wasn't there. Aaron didn't forget that sentence. He wrote it, uncharacteristically, on a sticky note and pressed it to the inside cover of his daily planner, where it stayed for years. It was Rose's illness, arriving suddenly on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday in March, that forced the reckoning Aaron had been avoiding. She'd seemed fine at breakfast, if a little quiet, but by mid-afternoon, Marisol called Aaron's office in a barely controlled panic. Rose had spiked a high fever, was struggling to breathe normally, and the pediatrician wanted her taken to the emergency room immediately as a precaution. Aaron was, at that exact moment, sitting at the head of a glass conference table on the 80th floor of a midtown tower, 40 minutes into what his team had spent 8 months preparing for, the final signing session for the Hudson waterfront deal, with a room full of investors, lawyers, and city officials waiting on his word to finalize an agreement worth over $2 billion. He looked at his phone buzzing on the table, Marisol's name flashing on the screen, and for one terrible second, the old version of Aaron, the one who had built an empire by never once looking away from the deal in front of him, hesitated. Every instinct trained into him over 20 years told him to silence the phone, finish the signing, and call back within the hour. It would only be an hour. Rose would be fine. This was what he'd built an entire team for, wasn't it? So that emergencies could be handled without him. But something in him, something that had been quietly rebuilding itself since the night he sat on the edge of Rose's wedged bed in the dark, refused to let that thought finish forming. He stood up in the middle of his own sentence, told the stunned room that something had come up, with his daughter, and the deal would have to wait, and walked out of the boardroom without a backward glance, leaving behind $2 billion, and 20 years of carefully cultivated reputation as the man who never let anything interrupt him. He made it to the hospital in 11 minutes, breaking every reasonable traffic law in Manhattan, and found Rose small and frightened in an oversized hospital bed, an oxygen monitor clipped to her finger, Marisol pale-faced beside her. It turned out to be a severe asthma flare, complicated by a respiratory infection, frightening but treatable, and within a few hours Rose was stable, breathing easier, drowsy from medication, but undeniably, wonderfully okay. Aaron sat beside her hospital bed until nearly midnight, holding her small hand, and it was there, in that quiet fluorescent-lit room, that something in him finally and permanently reordered itself. He thought about the boardroom he'd walked out of, the deal that might now collapse entirely because of his absence, the reputation he'd spent 2 decades constructing as a man who was always, unshakably, in control. And he found, to his own genuine surprise, that he didn't care. Not really. Not compared to this. He'd spent years building monuments to his own success, and had somehow convinced himself that the monuments were the point. Sitting there with his daughter's small hand in his, he understood with total clarity that he had been measuring his life by the wrong ruler entirely. The Monday after Rose's hospital stay, Aaron's general counsel called him in a state of barely restrained panic, certain the Hudson investors would use his walkout as leverage to renegotiate terms or abandon the deal outright. Aaron told him, with a calm that surprised them both, to let the chips fall wherever they landed, and if the deal collapsed because he'd left to sit with his sick daughter, then it had never been a deal worth more than she was to begin with. Remarkably, it didn't collapse. His team managed to hold it together, and investors, oddly enough, seemed to respect a man who would walk away from $2 billion for his sick child more than they'd ever respected the version of him who wouldn't have. One of the lead investors, a notoriously hard-nosed man named Whitfield Chase, later told Aaron over drinks that the walkout was the single thing that made him trust Aaron enough to sign, reasoning that a man who protected what mattered most to him under pressure was exactly the kind of man who'd protect an investment the same way. But something had changed in Aaron regardless, independent of whether the deal survived or the investors approved. He began, deliberately and systematically, to rebuild his life around a different center of gravity. He restructured Whitmore Development from the ground up, promoting a trusted deputy to handle the day-to-day operations that used to consume his every waking hour, keeping for himself only the decisions that truly required his judgment. He blocked out mornings and evenings on his calendar with the same ruthless protection he'd once reserved for billion-dollar negotiations. and woe to any executive who tried to schedule over them. He learned to braid hair, badly at first, and then with genuine competence. Learned the difference between the 17 stuffed animals that mattered to Rose and the ones that were merely decorative. Learned to sit through school plays without checking his phone. Learned that Lily needed quiet presence more than advice, and that Rose needed loud, silly, undignified engagement. Races down the hallway, ridiculous voices during bedtime stories, a father willing to be laughed at. There were women, in those years, who found their way into Aaron's orbit. Plenty of them, given his wealth and his newly visible devotion to his daughters, which somehow made him even more compelling to a certain kind of person. Aaron dated occasionally, cautiously, but he made a decision early on and held to it with the same discipline he once reserved for closing deals. He would not remarry, would not introduce a new permanent figure into his daughters' lives until they were old enough to have real say in what stability meant to them. He'd watched Lily, in particular, flinch subtly at the mention of any woman staying for breakfast, still guarded from the loss of her mother's daily presence. And Aaron decided that his daughter's sense of safety mattered infinitely more than his own loneliness. He would be, for as long as they needed him to be, both the father and the steady, present mother they'd lost. It wasn't easy, and the story of those years isn't one of effortless triumph. There were nights Aaron sat alone in the penthouse after the girls were asleep, exhausted in a way no boardroom had ever exhausted him, wondering if he was getting any of it right. There were arguments with Lily as she moved through the particular thorns of adolescence, slammed doors and silences that made Aaron feel, briefly, as incompetent as he had that very first night. There were moments, Rose asked, with the blunt honesty only children possess, why her mother didn't want to be around. Questions Aaron answered as gently and honestly as he could, refusing to poison his daughters against Evelyn even when it would have been easier, telling them instead that some people love in ways that look different from what you need, and that it says nothing about your worth when someone else's love falls short. One particular argument, when Lily was 14, stayed with Aaron long after it ended. She'd wanted to spend spring break with a friend's family at a lake house, and Aaron, uneasy about a group of young teenagers unsupervised for part of the trip, had said no. Lily, furious in the specific, wounding way only a teenager can be, had shouted that he only cared now because he felt guilty, that his sudden devotion was just another project he'd decided to be good at, the way he was good at everything else he touched. The words landed exactly where she'd aimed them. Aaron didn't raise his voice back. He sat down at the kitchen island, waited for her breathing to slow, and told her the truth, that she was right to be angry at how long it had taken him to become the father she'd needed, that no explanation would undo those earlier years, and that he wasn't asking her to forget any of it, only to let him keep trying. Lily didn't apologize that night, and Aaron didn't expect her to. But 2 days later, she left a note on his desk, 4 words long. Okay, different family. Sorry. It was, in its own guarded teenage way, the closest thing to forgiveness he'd received since the divorce. And he kept the note in the same planner as Marisol's sentence about spreadsheets. Evelyn remained a periodic presence, a birthday visit here, an awkward holiday dinner there, always polished and distant, like a relative rather than a mother. Over time, the girls stopped waiting for her calls to come, stopped rearranging their schedules around her unreliable availability, and redirected that expectant hope toward the parent who had actually earned it. Aaron never gloated about this, never made it a competition, but he noticed, with a private ache that was equal parts grief and gratitude, the exact moment each daughter stopped looking for their mother at school events and simply looked, instead, for him. Whitmore development continued to grow throughout these years, though differently than it might have under the old version of Aaron. He turned down deals that would have required extended overseas travel during the school year. He walked away from a partnership worth hundreds of millions when the other party's timeline would have meant missing both daughters' first weeks of a new school. His board occasionally grumbled about opportunity costs, about growth curves that might have been steeper under a more singularly focused leader, and Aaron, unbothered in a way that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier, told them plainly that he'd already built enough monuments for one lifetime and had exactly two things left worth building carefully: his daughters. By the time Lily turned 16, something had settled and steadied in their small, reconfigured family. She'd grown into a thoughtful, quietly funny young woman, sharp enough to see through pretense in the way children of complicated divorces often are, but warm underneath the guardedness, especially with Rose, who idolized her older sister with the particular ferocity of a younger sibling. Aaron watched the two of them together sometimes, doing homework at the kitchen island, arguing cheerfully about a television show, Lily patiently helping Rose with a school project, and felt something in his chest that no closed deal had ever quite matched: the specific, quiet pride of having built something that would outlast every tower with his name on it. Rose's journey through those years looked different from her older sister's, quieter in its struggles but no less real. Where Lily processed the divorce through guardedness and sharp observation, Rose processed it through a persistent, low-grade anxiety that surfaced most acutely around illness. Understandable, perhaps, given that her own hospital stay had marked the hinge point of the entire family's story, though no one, including Rose herself, fully connected those dots until years later. She developed a habit, well into her early teens, of checking obsessively on her father whenever he had so much as a cold, hovering at doorways, asking Marisol in a whisper whether he seemed okay. Aaron noticed, and rather than dismissing it as childish worry, sat with her one evening and gently asked what she was really afraid of. Rose, 12 at the time, admitted through tears that she sometimes worried everyone she loved would eventually leave in one way or another, her mother by choice, and maybe her father by something he couldn't help. Aaron didn't offer empty reassurances. He told her that he couldn't promise her nothing bad would ever happen, but he could promise her that as long as he had any say in the matter, he would never again let anything, deal or disaster, pull him away from showing up for her. It became something of a quiet ritual between them after that. Whenever Rose felt the old anxiety creeping back, she'd simply ask him, "Are you showing up?" And Aaron would always answer, "Every time." By 16, Rose had grown into a sharper, steadier version of that anxious younger girl, still prone to worry, but anchored now by years of evidence that her father meant what he's promised. The years accelerated the way they do once children reach adolescence, and before Aaron felt entirely prepared for it, Lily was finishing her final year of high school, applying to colleges, standing taller than her mother had been the day she walked out the door. Rose, now 16 herself, had grown into a sharp, funny teenager who still, on hard days, crawled into her father's study to do homework on the couch just to be near him, a habit neither of them had ever bothered to break. Lily's graduation was held on a bright June morning in a sunlit university auditorium, the kind of golden late spring light that made everything look slightly more cinematic than real life usually allows. Aaron sat in the audience in a pale gray suit, Rose beside him fidgeting with the commencement program, both of them scanning the rows of graduates for a glimpse of Lily's cap. Evelyn had been invited, as she always was, to major milestones, and had sent a brief, elegant bouquet of flowers with a card wishing Lily well. She did not attend in person, a small, unsurprising absence that no longer had the power to wound the way it once might have. When the ceremony reached its final portion, remarks from the class valedictorian, Aaron felt Rose grip his hand before he'd descend even fully processed that the graduate walking toward the podium was his own daughter. Lily stood at the microphone for a moment, scanning the crowd, and Aaron watched her find him in the sea of faces the way she always had, ever since she was small enough to search for him at every school assembly and dance recital he'd ever managed to attend. She spoke first about the expected things, gratitude to teachers, nostalgia for the friendships built over 4 years, hope for the uncertain future ahead of her class. But then her voice shifted, quieter and more deliberate, and she said that she wanted to talk for a moment about home, because she'd realized, working on this speech, that home was the thing she understood least clearly and had thought about most deeply. She told the auditorium, without naming names or dwelling on details that weren't hers to share publicly, that her family hadn't looked the way she once assumed families were supposed to look. That there had been a version of her childhood where the parent who built enormous, celebrated buildings for other people almost failed to notice he had a family of his own to build for. That there had been loss, real and disorienting, at an age too young to fully understand it. And that somewhere in the middle of that loss, something had changed. A single parent had made an impossible, unglamorous decision to show up every day in the small, unremarkable ways that never make it into any magazine profile. The terrible hair braiding, the ridiculous bedtime voices, the walked out of boardrooms, the protected evenings, the years of steady, unshowy presence that slowly, patiently, rebuilt something that had once felt broken beyond repair. My father has built towers that will stand in this city long after all of us are gone, Lily said, her voice steady now despite the tears gathering at the edges. People call them his masterpieces, but I grew up inside his real masterpiece, and it was never made of glass or steel. It was built one ordinary evening at a time, out of every deal he walked away from, so he could be somewhere smaller and quieter and more important. It was built by a man who chose, over and over again, for years, to be present instead of impressive. That's the building I'll spend my whole life trying to live up to. The auditorium rose to its feet before she'd even finished her final sentence. Applause swelling in a way that clearly startled Lily herself, who hadn't expected the room to react so powerfully to words she used to written mostly for her father and sister. Aaron sat frozen for one full second, the way people do when something they've hoped for without ever quite admitting it finally, unmistakably arrives, and then he was on his feet like everyone else. Rose beside him crying openly and unashamedly, both of them clapping for a daughter and sister who had just said, in front of several hundred strangers, the thing none of them had ever quite found the words for at home. Afterward, in the crush of families and photographs on the auditorium lawn, Lily found her father before she found anyone else, pushing through the crowd the way she used to, as a little girl searching for him in a sea of taller adults. She didn't say anything elaborate when she reached him, just wrapped her arms around him and said, simply, "Thank you for staying." And Aaron, a man who had once measured his worth in skylines and billion-dollar signatures, found that he had absolutely no response sophisticated enough for that sentence, except to hold his daughter and let himself, finally, fully believe her. Aaron Whitmore's company would go on to complete the Hudson Waterfront Tower 2 years later, and it would indeed become one of the most celebrated buildings of his career, photographed and written about and pointed to as proof of his genius. He still, when asked in interviews about his greatest professional achievement, gives the expected answer, names the tower, describes the engineering challenges they overcame. But if you ask him privately, late enough in the evening, and honestly enough for the truthful answer to surface, he'll tell you what he told Lily quietly on the lawn that June afternoon, holding both his daughters at once for the first time in longer than he could remember, that the towers were never the masterpiece. They were just buildings. The real masterpiece had been built in the small, unglamorous, undocumented hours he'd not almost let the empire steal from him, and that of everything he's ever constructed in a life built on ambition. That quiet, ordinary home was the only thing he'd ever truly gotten exactly right. The one structure, unlike any tower, that had been built entirely out of showing up, and had never once needed his name carved into its walls to matter.